Snow fell and wind howled. It was fit for neither man nor beast outside. The tiny mountain inn was the only safe, warm spot for miles in any direction, and it had gathered quite a few refugees from the harsh weather. Most of them had retired to their rooms due to the late hour, but a few of the more gregarious ones sat around the fireplace, enjoying the company of new friends. They had each found their way here through separate circumstances, and while they were unlikely to travel together in the morning, in the moment they were content to bask in the warmth of the low firelight together.
Quite the storm tonight,
A red-haired man casually mentioned as the wind roared through the eaves of the building. A tall brunette woman standing near the window nodded in agreement as she gazed out into the swirling snow a moment longer. She returned to her chair by the fire, sweeping her long travel skirt delicately out of the way as she tucked one leg underneath, curling into her seat. A young dark-haired man watched as she settled in, then stood himself, pacing over to place another log on the fire before returning to his spot. A blonde woman smiled contentedly as the new log caught fire, casting a bit more light on her new companions.
I'm just glad we're in here and not out there,
The dark-haired man said, gesturing tersely at the window.
It was only by the slimmest chance I even found this place. I could have frozen to death out there.
He shivered once and pulled his chair closer to the fire as if to ward off the chill.
Yes, that's one hell of a storm. A blizzard like none I've ever seen.
Commented an older gentleman.
We should be glad we all made it here in one piece. If we were out there, we might not last until morning.
bah.
The red-haired man scoffed boastfully.
I've survived much worse than this.
He showed off his hand in the low firelight. There was a small star-shaped scar on the back of his left hand. The other travelers looked at it appraisingly, mostly unimpressed.
My name is Babnova, and I'll tell you how I got this scar. We were 3 days out of Newport. I came to the deck hoping for a fresh breeze, but fog clung to the sea that morn, thick and oily. The air ripened with a cloying, rotten sweetness so gradually that I thought I might have imagined it until I saw another crewmate heaving his breakfast all over the rails. I gagged. The stench would have seemed at home clinging to a 10-day cadaver liberally doused with honey. Poor midshipman Aarons may have been the first to succumb to the aromatic odor, but soon the rails were crowded by crew and passengers alike, offering the contents of their guts to the deep blue sea. I heard a mighty splash from the other side of the vessel, and even as my mind quailed to imagine a man overboard in those polluted waters, I heard another hand shout, "Kraken!" I beheld tentacles towering dozens of meters above the ship's mast, suckers grasping and tearing at flesh, spiked ends spearing through flesh and metal plating alike. Pandemonium reigned across the deck, people shoving each other in vain pursuit of safety, gibbering in reasonless terror. The splash of body after body fleeing the damned vessel. I awoke to the sound of waves and a throbbing headache, as if my brain wished to escape the confines of my skull. I was lying on the deck, not far from where I'd been standing. Something sticky pulled at my left hand when I lifted it and beheld a squid, only barely larger than my thumbnail. The faintest whiff of sweetness and carrion seemed to follow that tiny corpse. I almost hurled the tiny monster into the sea, only for my eye to catch upon the state of my surroundings. Alone aboard that ship, I found a bottle of spirits in which to preserve the only other witness. It was days later, as I recovered in a hospital and endured round after round of interrogation as to the fate of the crew, that I slowly came to realize exactly what I had survived. This tiny star-like scar on the back of my hand, the Scar of Celeste, is my only memento of my encounter with the mind-melting Kraken.
Babnova sat back as though expecting applause, having finished his tale, but was met with teasing boos and groans from most of his audience. The tall woman remained silent but for an enigmatic smile, but his second companion laughed aloud.
A kraken? Really? So where is this beastie you trapped in a bottle?
The young, dark-haired man roared through his laughter. Babnova shrugged casually.
Sold it to a museum.
Babnova said. At the younger man's laugh, Babnova cracked a smile, then a chuckle of his own, one the others all joined in on.
If you want to hear about a scar, I'll tell you about this one,
The young man announced. He turned his back to the others and pulled his shirt up. There was a puckered scar on his right shoulder blade, close to the spine. Once the man was reasonably assured that the others had seen it, he lowered his shirt and turned to face them.
My name's Seraph, and this is my story. I worked at a place that made the siding for self-storage units for a decade. Each day I'd clock in and walk over to the roller press. The manager would slip in the correct roller and check that the cutter was in the right position, and we'd begin. Bottom slats of wood, then 10 pieces of metal at a time, stacking them without scraping them and setting them on the wooden slats. Then we'd stack the next 10. We'd steal a few moments to fit in the wooden spacers. Order complete, slip on the top slats, band and crane it out of the way. Over and over again, over 100 tons of metal moved by hand all of 2 feet, then machinery to handle the rest. An hour for lunch, then back at it, cutting extra bands while the manager figured out what the next job was, then back at it, telling the same stale jokes, laughing at the same dry punchlines, then back at it, over and over again. There were days when I felt the rollers had more variety in their lives than I did, when the threat of being shoved into a trash can when I looked too absorbed in my work sounded almost like it would be a nice change of pace. My work friends told the same stories from their lives so often that I almost thought I knew their lives as well as I did my own. It's not like there was much to know. My boss fished, but he never caught anything. Either nothing was biting or they just got away. My coworker did wood burnings. He mentioned making some deer heads and skulls and campfires, but he never showed them to anyone. And I gamed. Match after match of some generic first-person shooter, always searching for something interesting, always doing the same stupid things over and over again. And then, one day, my boss actually said something different. He had this funny look in his eye as he smacked me on the back and my shirt pinched. Then he said, "Son, you've been here every day for the last 10 years. Take some vacation." I asked him to say it again, and he did. I think he had to say it 5 times before it clicked. I clocked out that day, went over to HR and asked for a couple weeks off, as soon as was reasonable. I still came in the next day, back at it, and the day after that, back at it, over and over again. And then it was time for my vacation. I woke up that day, put on my work clothes, packed my work lunch, went out to my car and sat there, keys in the ignition, hands on my lap, nowhere to go, nowhere to be. I sat there as the sun rose above the horizon, the first time in years that I wasn't driving into it as it rose, or sleeping through it on the weekend. I drove to the south for a while, country roads, back roads, any road with an interesting name. I hit dead ends over and over again, but then I'd run out of them and end up on a major road for a while, back at it. I ate fast food and slept in shitty hotels, and then I'd be back at it, over and over again. I saw more of this country in those 2 weeks than I had in my life up to that point. Pulled over to really enjoy the rising or setting of the sun, then back at it. I'd stop at small B&Bs and talk to the people there and listen to their stories over and over again. I almost felt alive. Then it was Monday, and I made it to work a few minutes early, back at it. At least, that's what I thought. My boss was talking to a couple of his colleagues in the parking lot. I walked over to join them in the conversation. He looked at me and thanked me for my service, said I should have a nice life. Then my coworker, who was also facing me, said the same thing, word for word. And then I turned around to face me, and I thanked me for my service, and told me to have a nice life. The words, the faces, over and over again. I ran back to my car, then I drove away. I still work there. My bank still gets the same deposit over and over again. I bear the Scar of Gemini on my back, but I never went back. I know if I ever did, I'd be right back there, back at it, doing the same things over and over again, telling the same jokes over and over again, laughing at the same punchlines over and over again, every day back at it. But I will never go back at it.
Zareth was met with silence as he finished his tale. The others shifted uncomfortably until the silence was broken by the older gentleman.
You turned around to face you?
The older gentleman asked incredulously, an uncomprehending look on his face. Zareth met his gaze levelly, his expression answering the older man's question beyond a doubt. The man shifted his eyes away from that piercing gaze and clapped his hands on his thighs before he stood, pacing before the others.
Well, I have a scar I could tell you about.
The gentleman said brightly, obviously trying to lighten the mood. He pulled the neckline of his shirt toward his shoulder, revealing a smattering of round scars on his upper chest. Allowing his shirt to slide back into place, he bowed cordially before the others.
My name is Orion, and I'll just bet you want to know how I got that scar.
Without waiting for a reply, he began his tale.
Have I got a story for you? All have heard of the savage Wendigo of the high Himalayas. I went in search of that legend, but only a madman would seek to try those high passes alone. 3 Sherpas were hired to guide us and carry our supplies, and I was further joined by 2 Westerners. One was a dark-countenanced Californian, tattooed and furtive, who seemed always to have one eye over his shoulder and the other on the rest of us. The second was a man of the cloth who introduced himself as Padre Sicarius, with a broad smile and a humble manner. I know what it is to be haunted by the past, and Callie, as I came to refer to him, had that look. Fear, not hunger, drove him, and while a cornered rabbit will bite or scratch, it will only do so in the quest for freedom. I figured the expedition might lighten his fears, at least for a little while, but I'll admit the Padre made me most curious. Why was he here? Shouldn't he be preaching to the masses or finding silence in some monastery? Something about him itched at the back of my mind, but foolishly I chose to set it aside and focus upon my own quest. We wended our way high into the mountains, in increments so slow it felt, as day melted into day, that nothing ever changed. Our dark glasses helped protect us from the glare of the sun off the ever-present ice and snow, but it also ruined even the grandest vistas. I took photos when the path was not overly burdensome, or when we stopped for meals or a quick breather. I enjoyed browsing these before I went to sleep, but a sense of futility began to overtake me. These mountains were vast. Would I ever find my Wendigo? The sun was beginning to set, and moonrise was not long to follow on the 3rd week of our travel, when our hired Sherpas fled at a rate we could not hope to follow. I stood in stupefaction, while Padre Sicarius took a few lunging steps forward, as if chasing our wayward guides. I was still off guard when he pivoted suddenly, revealing a shotgun from under his heavy outer coat and brandishing it at us. With a beatific smile, he revealed that he had paid off the Sherpas and knew that one of us was his prey. I was caught in stunned disbelief. Even now the man of the cloth revealed no base emotions, showing only the joy of the righteous as he leveled his firearm at me with murderous intent. Did he think me some demon? I heard a heavy sigh. Cloth strained and ripped behind me, and I spun to face Callie. The barely 5-foot-tall mestizo man was no more. In his place, a giant twice that height, with pearlescent fur ringing that same familiar face. To my shock, he looked more like an ancient silverback gorilla than the man I thought I knew, but his voice was also unchanged, if resigned rather than fearful. He asked that I be spared, as I had no part in this, but the churchly man declared that such sights were not meant to be shared, and that I should soon follow him to the grave, if perhaps not to the depths of hell. I was still staring at Callie when the gun shattered the evening behind me. It felt like I'd been punched in the shoulder. I fell hard. The mountains rumbled, loosing the mother of all avalanches upon us. I awoke in a stone domicile, lit by what seemed to be bioluminescent mosses. A woven blanket of superb pattern and softness covered me, and the bed beneath left me feeling like I had fallen to the embrace of a cloud. A gentle cough drew my attention from my bed to the rest of the room. It was incredible. Figurines and carvings that glistened like glass filled every nook and alcove. The furniture likewise glistened beneath woven cloth padding. Callie sat patiently in the corner, watching my expression with amusement. When he finally received my attention, his face turned to regret. He apologized for his role in the previous evening's events, and said that once I healed, he would see to it that I safely returned to my civilization. The shot meant for him had been deflected by one of his kin, who had seen the encounter and intervened. It was silver shot, he told me, meant for hunting werewolves, which he and his kin were sometimes mistaken for when they ventured into the lowlands. He pointed out a container on the table with the metal, saying that it had been removed from my shoulder to allow it to properly heal. He warned me, however, that the jar was made of ice, and the shot should be transferred to a more suitable container before my return to the lowlands. I spent several weeks in convalescence there, and later simply in enjoying exploring that hidden civilization, but eventually I did accept their offer to return me to my own folk. This, you see, was the story of how I acquired the Scar of Judas.
Wait. The Wendigo actually saved you?
The blonde woman said through her derisive chuckles. Orion looked at her, nonplussed.
And why not? Not all humans are good people. Why can't some monsters be kind?
Orion expounded. Unable to find logic against this argument, the others settled for shrugging it off as yet another of the tales that just seemed to keep getting taller around this fire.
My own personal monster wasn't anywhere near as kind as yours was.
The blonde woman intoned with a shudder. The firelight was fading, but it was just bright enough to see a faint thin line on her left cheek, just below her eye. It was so light none might have seen it unless they studied her closely. Intrigued, they all unconsciously leaned closer to hear her tale.
My name is Nicole, and this is my story. I had been dissatisfied with the way things had been going in my life for a while. I worked, I ate, I slept, and I repeated it all the next day. I kept living the same day every day. Wake up, shower, work, go home, eat, sleep. No variety, no enrichment, no enjoyment. I could have taken the time to add in a change somewhere, but it just seemed like a lot of effort for a little payoff. Not worth the time or energy. Day by day, I felt apathy stealing over me. Once I had cared about the shambles my life had become. Now I felt nothing. Lethargy ruled my days, and I spent as much time as possible sleeping. On the weekends, I would occasionally make an effort to see friends. Gradually, this too began to seem like too much effort until I stopped making plans. I went to bed one night, expecting more of the same the next day, and utterly unable to care about it. Most of the time, I closed my eyes and fell into a dark, dreamless slumber that my alarm clock could barely rouse me from. Tonight, for no particular reason I could discern, I opened my eyes to see the alarm clock reading 3:33 a.m. It was far too early to get up, so I closed my eyes and tried to go back to sleep. I felt a tickling sensation on my foot. I tried to shake it to move my leg, but I found I couldn't. My eyes snapped open in horror. What was wrong with me? I was able to move just enough to see the most hideous scaly head peering at me from the foot of the bed. The demonic-looking creature had its scaled hand touching my foot, and it lightly scraped a claw across the top of my foot once more before grasping the bedsheets and crawling up the bed towards my face. Paralyzed, horrified, I could do nothing but watch as the demon snaked its way up my body, then came to rest atop my chest, pinning me to the bed. I couldn't have moved if I had tried. I watched as it contemplated me for a few seconds, then reached down and dragged that same sharp nail across my cheek, tearing my skin. It licked my blood off its claw, then hissed a sinister laugh. I must have passed out in my terror. When I awoke again, the demon was gone. Perhaps it had never been there. But why then was there blood on my pillow and a cut on my cheek? I never did figure that out. The Scar of Dorian remains.
Silence reigned for a short while after her tale finished. The other travelers glanced at each other uncomfortably, none sure how to follow up after that. The tall woman reached over and patted her shoulder companionably, and the blonde woman looked at her with a grateful smile. The tension draining fast after that, the first man who spoke stood again. Wordlessly, he drew up his sleeve, revealing a large scar just above his elbow. Once everyone had seen it, he drew his shirt sleeve down and grinned at the group.
Curious? All right, I'll tell you. There I was, me to snout with the biggest shark since the end of the Jurassic Age. I was wondering to myself how such a beast had survived the passing of the eons. I'd just moved on to the far more salient question of whether there might be a boat big enough to keep me safe when it charged. I dodged as quickly as I could, desperately lunging skyward, only to be engulfed in darkness. I thought it had swallowed me. Then it turned its massive head, and sunlight illuminated the nair in which I'd found myself. This leviathan of legend went berserk. It must have been overwhelmed with the scent of me, caught as I was within a few scant meters of its nasal sac. I don't know how I survived the next hours, battered and dashed against it over and over again, my blood serving only to increase the frenzy. At first, day and night seemed to swap with every shake of that massive cranium, but eventually it slowed, and I realized that brightest noon had been replaced by the paler glimmer of twilight. I suppose it must have slept as I slowly eased myself from my erstwhile shelter. I swam for the surface, for the shore, and then, as soon as I had made my way to a suitable vehicle, I made all haste for the mountains. We may have tamed the lands, but the seas? Oh, the seas. I will not soon venture back to those forbidding depths. And that, you see, is the story of how I acquired the Scar of Ishmael.
His first story had been met with boos and laughter, and this one was no different. He shrugged it off good-naturedly as the others crowed.
I've heard of fish stories, but that one is a real whopper.
Orion howled through his laughter.
I'll bet that shark was the size of a trout, if it existed at all.
The blonde woman, bent double in her seat, shook with the force of her mirth.
That's utterly impossible. Underwater all that time? How did you breathe?
Nicole pointed out through her laughter. Babnoba grinned widely.
Scuba tank,
He explained with a wink. This elicited a fresh gale of laughter from Nicole, more at his dedication to the tale than to his response. She recovered from her fit of laughter with a shake of her head and a huge fond smile.
I once knew someone who told unbelievable tales like that. After my experience with the demon that gave me the scar, I knew something had to change. So I began to travel, to meet people. And there's one lady I don't think I'll ever forget.
Pausing a moment, she showed off her right hand in the firelight. In the center of her palm, there was an unusual scar that might almost have been a brand, in the shape of an eternity symbol. With a small smile, she closed her fingers around the scar almost affectionately, as though holding it to herself.
This one isn't a scar of pain and fear. Rather, this scar is a reminder that death is not the end. I came into London on the overnight Eurostar, got off at Waterloo. I'd heard stories of the fog there, but somehow I wasn't prepared. If I'd had a fork, I'll wager I could have speared a chunk of it and swallowed it whole. I wasn't really sure where I was going, but I'd been sitting quite long enough and decided to have a little wander. A lady hobbled up to me, bent but unbroken by the weight of her decades. She admitted that despite being a native, she'd found herself quite turned around and inquired as to the location of the Waterloo. Having nothing better to do, and just having come from there myself, I offered to escort her. She was so grateful it made my heart melt in my chest. It felt like she'd been meandering forever, she confessed, and I grinned, holding back a comment that her outfit did seem a little dated. Foggy as it was, the station seemed a bit more ramshackle than when I'd first arrived, and less organized, but that was probably because I was actually trying to find something, I thought to myself. Brookwood had its own station within the station, and the attendant there thanked me for escorting the old lady, passing a ticket to her and offering me a round-trip ticket if I wished to accompany her a little while. I didn't recognize the name, but the sound of it was quite lovely. I'd been less than impressed with the grey streets and narrow alleys of London anyway, so I said that I would appreciate that. I was more than a little surprised when he handed me the ticket without even asking payment. The train was a somber affair, but comfortable, especially in first class. The heavy weight of years seemed to ease from her shoulders when the steward seated us, so I was more than happy to relax there with her, even though the train wasn't due to depart till 11:15. Soon she was regaling me with tales from her life, each more fantastic than the last. I knew she must be having me on when she talked about the first motor carriages to grace London streets, but was enjoying the company far too much to complain. The steward regularly brought refreshments, and the woman kept me in gales of laughter till the train departed with a mournful whistle from its steam engine. She seemed to become more vibrant with each passing kilometer, telling me uproarious tales of the young soldiers she'd teased and bedded in her youth. I was bright red, but she was absolutely shameless, and my sides ached from laughter when the train finally eased to a stop with another mournful whistle. The steward ushered her out, cheerfully wishing her well, while indicating that I was to stay on the train. As the young woman skipped gaily away across fields of flowers, the steward took a seat beside me and toyed with the cane she'd left behind. The train pulled away from that station and was swiftly surrounded by dense banks of fog, and the steward turned towards me. He shook my hand and thanked me for helping such a lost soul finally find her way. About 40 minutes later, the train pulled into Brookwood Station. The cemetery was lovely, a splendor of trees shading monuments from the last 150 years. As I walked out of the station, the fog finally cleared, and in the sunlight, as I glanced about, I found myself only slightly startled to see that the station had long been out of service, and no track led to it anymore. All that remains of my train ride are my memories and this, the Scar of Charon.
After Nicole finished her story, the other travelers had mixed reactions. The tall brunette woman looked contented, pleased even. Orion had a look of wonder on his face. Zareth's expression was unreadable, and Babnova stood to add another log to the fire, hiding his expression from the others. "How wonderful," the tall woman said. "You were able to help that lady move on. That was very brave of you," she commented, reaching out a hand to Nicole.
That's quite comforting if you think about it.
Orion said as Babnova returned to his chair.
But I already knew that everything and everyone is connected.
He tapped his forehead, pointing out a thin scar near his hairline.
Everyone knows that Australia is the wildest of lands, only recently settled in the grand scheme of things. Old Three Toes is still enough to give a seasoned traveler such as myself a run for his money, and as long as I'd been away, I half worried the drop bears wouldn't recognize me. Still, I was home, and I had another grand adventure planned. Ayers Rock had loomed over my childhood at Alice Springs. not quite as popular with tourists as the Himalayas, I'd nevertheless seen over 100 times as many tourists as townfolk every year. The ice caverns of the Wendigo had opened my eyes in more ways than one, I felt. I'd left the town of Alice Springs, never having visited the looming rock, never having wanted to either. It was a tourist trap and nothing more, I'd been sure. Now, though, when I came back, I tried to explain this to my mates. They thought I'd gone bonkers. I prepped my gear, backpack, water, a day's worth of protein bars and snacks, and my camera. After the Himalayas, I felt wildly underprepared. That was gnawing at me as I went to sleep. I woke early. I grabbed my backpack and left my flat. A man was waiting for me just outside my door. He wore plain shorts, a white headband, and was covered in body paint, horizontal stripes across his torso and arms, more of a leopard pattern for his legs. He was the only one about. He said he could be my guide. He said that if I really wanted to see Uluru, I didn't need my camera at all. It would just get in the way. I didn't question this, left my backpack just inside my flat, and followed him. We walked trails I'd never heard of nor imagined, and he told me stories as we went. The two boys playing in the rain, piling mud until it became Uluru, before finding a place to rest on Mount Connor, where they sleep as boulders to this day. Kania, in her desperate rage, smashing the venomous Liru, before resting against the rock wall until she became a line upon it. Every place had a story. I was living in the time of myths and legends. And then I awoke. My backpack sat right inside the door where I left it before following the guide. And when I looked around me, I felt like I understood something. Uluru is sacred to the people whose ancestors lived and died on those lands. The dream, though, is not bound by borders or geography. It extends everywhere and is everything, as everything is one. Ripples in a pond. Every action we take eventually reaches out and touches someone else. Distance doesn't matter, and every action is significant. Makes you want to try a little harder to be the best you are able, doesn't it?
Orion asked the group. His question was met with smiles and nods of approval.
This scar will always remind me of the wisdom I received.
But how did you get that scar?
Bavnova asked. Orion looked at him, confused. When Orion made no move to respond, Bavnova pressed the issue.
You never mentioned how you got the injury that gave you that scar. You never mentioned that scar at all.
Orion looked baffled, then shook his head.
Didn't I? Slipped my mind.
He said dismissively. Touched by the story and hoping to ease past the awkward moment, Zareth stood and pulled up the leg of his pants, revealing a jagged scar on his leg. Letting it drop back down, he took his seat once again, leaning back in his chair comfortably.
After my stint at the siding place, I finally met someone. The girl of my dreams. Life finally had meaning for me. For once, I was living, not just existing, and it was all because of her. So, I did the only thing that made sense to me. I asked her to marry me.
Zareth said, his expression unreadable.
She agreed, and we began to plan the wedding. Everything was going great up until about a week before the wedding. That's when it all took a turn for the worst. My luck bottomed out before I arrived at Vegas, though I didn't suspect it at first. My bachelor party was meant to arrive there by plane, but a tropical storm forced us to land in Boulder City instead. The luggage ended up totally lost in the confusion, and the rental car that they comped us broke down less than 20 minutes after we picked it up. When we did pick up the car they graciously provided us, we thought our luck was looking up. It was a sporty-looking Mustang, a real guy's car, and a convertible at that. It was great, while it lasted. 2 miles from our hotel, we heard a loud clunk, then the car started losing speed fast. We swerved onto the shoulder as it died. We called the rental place, but it was already closed. The night person at the company said they'd tow the Mustang and provide us a replacement in the morning. We hiked the rest of the way to our hotel. It wasn't that bad until the last half mile, when a heavy rainstorm decided the desert needed a change of pace. We changed our pace too. We got to the hotel at midnight. They'd already given our rooms away, but the hotel clerk heard out our tale of woe and said that though they didn't have any vacancies, we could sleep in the lobby. It wasn't ideal, but it was a roof over our head with few other options. After all this misfortune, we really should have just called it a night, but no. Someone said our luck was just bound to change, so like the hopeful idiots we were, we left our carry-ons with the front desk clerk and went to the closest casino. We hit slot machines, roulette wheels, learned how to lose at craps and poker, and with the last bit of cash we had, busted our hands at blackjack. We slunk back to the hotel only to find a new clerk had taken over and our carry-ons had left with the previous. Bereft of our chargers and with the storm preventing any phone calls, I could only hope that my fiancée wasn't too worried. I slept fitfully among my friends in the hotel lobby. The next morning seemed to favor us once more, as our new rental car was delivered not long after the original clerk returned with our carry-ons. The weather had finally cleared, but my phone was dead. We decided to leave that godforsaken city. Goodbye, glitz and glamour. We were going to return to nature for the rest of our weekend. Heading west towards California, we decided to visit some of the more famous national parks on our way to the coast. My friends graciously allowed me to charge my phone first as we drove. As my phone powered back on from fully dead, it let out the cheery ding that announced a text from my fiancée. Hey, I know this is the worst possible way to do this, but sorry, baby. I just can't go through with this. I know this is cowardly of me, but I've thought about it for a long time, and I just don't think I'm good for you. I know you'll find someone better someday. The initial joy I felt at seeing her words turned to ash at the contents. I called, but it wouldn't connect. I texted, begging for answers, an explanation, anything, only to get an automated reply that I'd been blocked. I put on a false face of cheer for my friends, told them everything was fine. When my friends pulled over at Death Valley to investigate the scenery, I wandered off by myself. I was hoping for some high cliff or maybe a venomous snake, anything to end my pain. A lightning-quick flash of brown caught my eye, and I chased it, not even knowing why. It went from the base of a cactus to some brush and vanished from my sight. I pursued, only for it to flash away again and again. It ran me ragged, darting up a narrow ravine I'd otherwise have missed, pausing just long enough for me to not lose it, before darting away and hiding again. It seemed to be losing steam, I thought to myself, panting and wheezing from the exertion. Another quick flash of brown, hop-sprinting away from me into another tangle of thorny briar bushes. I'd gotten a better look this time. It might have been a large rabbit, somewhat gangly in its appearance, but something seemed off about its head. Maybe it was tangled in some branches. Concerned for the poor creature, I knelt down, cursing as something cut my leg. The rabbit stared back at me, nose wiggling, and I blinked, startled. It wasn't tangled in branches. This rabbit had horns growing out of its head. I pulled out my phone to snap a picture of the thing, but dropped it onto the sandy ground. In the semi-darkness that was falling, I fumbled it even further away from me into the sand. I'd been unwilling to look away from the creature long enough to grab my phone, and now I was paying for it. Frustrated, I focused on my phone and swept aside some of the sand covering it, and noticed a cool, hard surface underneath. Brushing away more, I traced a metal rectangle. I dug and I dug to free the object, revealing a metal box, complete with a rusted lock. I smashed the lock and discovered antiquated money filling the box. who knows how long it had been lost, less than a rock in the desert, but in my eyes it gained worth, not for the reward I could surely gain by returning it to some museum, but for reminding me of how much value was dependent on the observer. I couldn't just give up. Grateful to the horned rabbit, I looked up quickly. I never saw it again, though the scar on my leg reminds me of the creature. I call it the Scar of Fortuna. I went back to my friends and came clean with what had happened and how I felt. I told them I had to go home and patch things up with her, or at least try to.
Zareth smiled wistfully.
My friends are great guys. They drove us all the way back home that day, right to our doorstep. I had no idea she would even be home, since she wasn't taking my calls. None of my friends could reach her either. But once we got there, I found her in the bedroom. She was lying on the floor, crying, surrounded by a mountain of packed boxes. She thought that I would have stayed away for the rest of the weekend and had planned to move out while I was gone.
Zareth said, shaking his head sadly.
I startled her when I barged in to find her like that. She looked at me, half-formed apologies starting to fall from her lips, but all I did was lay down next to her and hold her. I told her how much meaning in my life would be gone if I lost her. I told her that I needed her with me to make anything worthwhile.
Zareth said with a gentle smile. He gazed into the fire, looking a bit lost in thought. The other travelers murmured their condolences, fearing the worst from his expression, and he shook his head and smiled.
Don't worry about me. I was just thinking I should head up to bed and check on her. She was pretty tired after the hike up here, and she fell asleep right away. If I know her, though, she'll be waking up about now.
Zareth said. His love for this woman was obvious in his smile as he excused himself and climbed the stairs to the rooms above. The other travelers smiled fondly as they thought of their own loved ones, past and present. Zareth's tale reminded them that love was ever present if you just knew where to look for it. The tall woman sighed happily at that thought and shifted in her chair. Her travel skirt slipped slightly, drawing the eye of everyone around the fire as she slid her right leg out from underneath her to join her left leg. That momentary glimpse of bare skin before she smoothed the skirt back into place revealed twin scars on her shin, 3 inches in length. They looked somewhat fresh and angry. The tall woman looked up, feeling eyes upon her. She glanced at each of them in turn, feeling more and more self-conscious as none of them looked away. Finally, she almost snapped. "What?" The blonde woman grinned mischievously.
Come on, you have a story to share too, it seems,
Nicole said, gesturing to the tall woman's leg. The woman blushed, tucking her right leg behind her left as if to hide it better. "That scar's nothing special. The story is not worth telling," the tall woman huffed. Cajoling entreaties erupted from the remaining travelers, escalating until the tall woman finally shook her head and caved in. "I'm a huge klutz, okay? I was at work. Someone came to my office wanting to borrow something, and when I stood up and walked over to get what they wanted, I forgot my lower desk drawer was open. The top of the drawer sliced my leg pretty bad, right here," the tall woman grumbled, peeling her skirt back to allow the others to look at the scars.
That's it?
Babnoma asked incredulously. At her emphatic nod, he sighed and shook his head.
No sense of theatrics. Don't you know that every injury, every scar is a story? And what story isn't made better with a little exaggeration?
The blonde woman crept over and knelt in front of the tall woman to examine the scar closer. Blushing at the close scrutiny and the audacity of the other woman, the tall woman pulled her skirt back over her leg, hiding it. Nicole looked up at her, then stood, returning to her seat with a laugh.
We never even asked. What is your name?
Nicole asked. It's Raven, the tall woman replied.
Nice to meet you,
Nicole responded.
But he's right, you know. Those scars, you can tell people they're from an animal attack. Fighting a mountain lion in the wilds? Yeah, I got this scar, the Scar of Samson. But you should see the lion.
Nicole said teasingly. Raven chuckled at the absurd statement, shaking her head. I'm generally not one for telling tall tales, but it has been great fun listening to all of these. I believe it's time for bed, Raven announced with a laugh. The fire had grown low in the fireplace, and with only embers left, they each made their way to their separate rooms. It had truly been a delightful evening. This series of stories is dedicated to my husband, Chris. We have a sometimes love. I say that because sometimes love is great, where we're having fun and playing together. Sometimes love can also be hard, though, where we're getting through tough times together. But that's the thing. Sometimes love, always worth it.